of who I am before we get started, and maybe that might help to provide a little bit of perspective of where I'm coming from and potentially how you can leverage it based on your backgrounds as well. So I'm May Terry. I'm what you call an engineer, which is a funky name, but there's actually a title around it. My background originally was in electrical engineering, and I worked in many different industries, from space technology to telecommunications, data networking, and then eventually I fell into healthcare, and I loved it and didn't want to go back, but I didn't want to lose my engineering chops in all these other industries, so I combined them both and got a master's in medical informatics. So electrical engineering, nursing, and medical informatics. I like to think that I have a little bit of an approach for both. Not only have I spent the last maybe 15 years in healthcare IT, I still am a nurse and volunteer twice a month in an outpatient clinic for the underserved communities. So chronic disease management is kind of my bag. So why is that important, I think, for this particular presentation? It's because oftentimes in this community, in these presentations, in what we go back to, it definitely appeals to the technical side of us, right? We get lots of tools, talk a lot about models, talk a lot about implementations, and suddenly the clinician or potentially the patient gets lost along the way. And this is kind of the quick story, which we probably have all more or less have run into at some point. Let's say that you have a reference lab that wants to standardize the transmission of some kind of specific type of lab report, right? And say, oh, we've only got something by paper. And we eventually want to have something that we can see maybe in one of these little mobile devices. So great. Now we have something that's unstructured. We want to make it structured. Eventually for a resource, you want an informaticist that, or an engineer, or someone that, or a data analyst that will work with a group of clinical subject matter experts to identify, hey, what's important for your workflow? What are the elements that are important for you? And everyone gets really excited in a kickoff meeting, and everyone wants to get involved, but suddenly something drops along the way. Maybe a couple of months later, that same clinical community comes back, and what you give them is this, which honestly, to your average clinician, depending who it is, means absolutely nothing. It's beautiful for me. In my own background, I have helped to author implementation guides. One in particular is called the Minimum Common Oncology Data Elements. Another one I've worked on is in Da Vinci. So for me, this is wonderful to look at, but it doesn't mean anything in terms of an implementation. So why? When we create these FHIR implementation guides, they're traditionally targeted for technical implementers. That makes sense. But really, they're not very clinically friendly. Now, what's nice is that if you think about the continuity of what we've been teaching along this track, David has done a wonderful job in trying to, perhaps give a tool that allows clinicians to potentially work with a particular data analyst. But taking it up one level, there's certain aspects that we probably want to be mindful of, because even when working at that, you still have this as your output. How do we get past that? Do we have to have clinicians wait until there are developed prototypes in order for them to finally realize this isn't really what I asked for? Why do we have to push this down? So that is kind of the introduction to what I kind of consider a methodology, so that when we think about information models, how do we maintain this idea that when we think about a person, this mental model that comes from a clinical subject matter expert, when it goes through that transformation, which in many cases becomes a black box, how do we know for sure that when we get to that final version of it, you don't have the same notion of a person? How do you know that you maintain that? Oh, sure, we call it semantic interoperability. Maintain meaning, maintain context. But realistically, how do you keep this kind of consistent to make sure that we are satisfying our primary stakeholders? We know models are fit for purpose. As much as we have FHIR R4, that has a whole set of resources that we're kind of building models to. The context has to be maintained to maintain that clinical mental model. How would you do that? Well, that's kind of what we're thinking about here. How do we take it up one step? And believe it, this is a methodology class for the most part. And I'm more than happy to talk details on modeling and reference implementations. I have some slides later on. But this is really more about how can we possibly help to streamline this kind of process such that the clinical SMEs are involved in every phase. Let's take it down a little bit more. Just to summarize it, just kind of quickly, we'll delve into each one of these in a little bit more detail. We're going to define our use case, gather this clinical information, translate them into data elements, then automagically develop the FHIR IG, validate it, and then release it for, quote, trial use. And what I mean by trial use is really more like kick the tires, not necessarily like the formal STU battling process. Now, these are pretty obvious high-level concepts, but let's delve into it a little bit deeper. Okay, so for the first step, when you define your use cases and drivers, right, what we really want to be thinking about here is what is driving the need for the model. Again, these seem to be very obvious notions, but how many times have you really thought, okay, here is my problem, and then you're immediately delving into prototyping? That happens way too often. Is it going to be a clinical workflow improvement? Is it regulatory, like in the case of US Core? Or potentially, some of the work that's happening with Da Vinci? Is it other? And who are the target actors, right? Oftentimes, when you are inside, a huge healthcare system, they're going to give you a physician champion. And if you're developing some kind of model for a nurse workflow, maybe you don't have the right actors. If you're doing this for laboratory, it's the same thing. So really identify who is your target actors along the way. And then finally, for this particular aspect, you have your clinical use case scenarios. Here's the thing that is kind of very different from what we have. Really, what you wanted is in plain text. So many times I hear, the initial problem statement, and then they're immediately jumping into models. Take a step back from it. Write it in plain text, and not necessarily the people who are the analysts. Have your clinical team write it in plain text. Create that example persona for the context, and this, which is very important because they're not necessarily going to be doing all that research for you. Analysts are going to be doing a lot of that research, or engineers in some cases, depending upon the size of your company. You're going to cite the clinical sources where applicable. Again, avoid modeling solutions in early phases. I know we have this temptation that, yes, it's going to be, what is it in FHIR? Oh my God, that's going to be a condition immediately. If you think about the history of where HL7 has gone, yes, FHIR is here to stay for quite a while. However, if you go back 25 years, it was HL7v2. And then at some point, it was HL7v3. And clinical document architecture. This is the latest flavor. So realistically, if you have a healthcare system, they're still going to be thinking about the models that they had previously. Their use cases need to be a little bit more fluid. Okay. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I want to give you an example of what it would be if they're going to write it in plain text from a clinical SME's perspective. And I'm going to use the implementation guide that was recently balloted called the Minimum Common Oncology Data Elements, or mCODE, as kind of the background, because this is where I kind of took a lot of my lumps along the way with one of the IGs that I worked on, and hopefully you can find some parallels if you've never worked on it before, or if you're thinking about creating one. This, for the most part, was kind of wordsmithed by myself, but a lot of it was mostly written by a team of clinical oncologists. And in this example, it was a patient that had multiple comorbid conditions, and then you'll find out that they had particular symptoms, and then there's a certain notion of staging, et cetera. The key point in this slide is that this would be your starting point for your persona. And it could very well be that if you're the only person on this project or part of a team of very technical people, yes, that might end up having some, a little bit of research behind it. But for the most part, clinical subject matter experts have to be the ones to start it. Don't start with a problem statement. Have them start with the use case scenario. It's almost like, in some respects, if you don't have those types of folks that are available, then you need to get them, right? Otherwise, your risk for having something that is likely not accurate or to their case is going to go pretty high. And we've also taken lumps in that too. Okay, so then that's the idea. Who do you need in this? Well, for one, you need, obviously, subject matter experts. And then the other one, I kind of bolded, an objective facilitator. As I mentioned from the start, yes, I'm an engineer, but I'm also a registered nurse. Am I an oncology nurse? No. Am I someone that diagnosed or staged cancer patients? No. If I'm going to put on my hat as a clinician, then in some respects, I'm going to keep my hat as a clinician. In this case, as in the IGs that I've worked on, I had to know to step back. And the only reason when I would go ahead and insert myself into that actual conversation is for clarity. And that's it. And not to come up with the particular conclusions because I read something or Googled it. And that's a very difficult thing to do, especially for those that have had a clinical background and suddenly have become informaticians, right? It's so easy to go, okay, yeah, I think I've worked with this in the past. But realistically, in this case, how do you keep it as focused to the environment and the use case as possible? It's to be as objective as possible, okay? Second one is encourage your clinical SMEs to speak in their own language. And it could very well be that you have almost no idea what they're talking about. And that might be okay. Have them capture it down. Don't filter it. Don't filter it. It's okay to ask what and why and where did you get that? Where can I learn more? Okay. Now I said include how many, whether you need it or not, and an example. Right? So we gave an example that they gave it in plain text. And try not to use the words like cardinality and optionality. Just say how many and what. And I can't stress enough how important this is. Clinical sources where applicable, not models. I've seen many a time where there have been particular use cases and immediately they went into like an information model that existed. Or, hey, we use ICD-10 for billing. That might be true. That might be the case, but that's not necessarily where they have the true source of where they're making their clinical decisions from. So in the case of mCODE, notice what it was important here was the fact that there was the American Joint Committee on Cancer staging manual, right? That there were a National Comprehensive Cancer Network guidelines. There's a College of American Pathologists, Semantic report. These are the things that drive the clinical workflow and the decisions that are made strictly in behalf of patient treatment. Now, if I had something like, here are the minimum data elements for astro, for radiation oncology, I would have probably said, that's nice, but that's not what's driving your decisions, right? It's got to be something else. Okay. So just kind of tying this, we're still defining the use cases, but now we're getting closer to defining the relevant clinical information. I know David had a much better picture that kind of color-coded a little bit more by domains. I think a little, without jumping straight to that, I probably wanted to take it one step back and go, what are the relevant keywords? The categorization behind it we can definitely do afterwards. But right now, what's relevant to the clinicians that they really want to know about to support this use case? It's the fact that this person is female, right? Again, we're thinking about cancer in this case, right? That they're female, that they might be a smoker, that they have long QT syndrome. It is the things that they are doing within their workflows and the key clinical words that are helping to drive it, like contraindications, performance statuses. Okay. Now here's a little bit of the crux of, I think, what might be helpful if you have it in your, I have this in the Dropbox, but this is actually one approach that I did, actually, that helped to drive the creation of mCODE. We realized we can't just start modeling quickly. Let's go ahead and have a template that helps to gather what their workflow is, what are the interesting information needed. Notice there's no word that says data in here or data type. It says, what is your workflow? What are the things that you do in it? What information do you need? Can you give me an example? These are things that facilitators will ask as part of this process. Where do you get it? Now, this is probably the most technical part of it, right? Oh, besides the clinical annotation. I think I ended up, in retrospect, I started jumping into, this is what it would be for SNOMED CT. That is a hand slap. I shouldn't have done that. Honestly. Right? You're going to hide it. But I think if you're going to think about this, once you start getting into these 4 columns, you're going to find afterwards that it becomes easier to prioritize. Because another thing that happens is as soon as you get people from different backgrounds, clinically, start getting to scope creep. If you've heard of that conversation before, it was, ooh, what about this workflow? I think it's important that we totally delve deep into the schema of EHRs, or my EHR doesn't really support that. It's so easy to get into that scope creep. Really try and fight that. I think the most important things are these first 4 columns. And then finally, the priority once you start going through it, because the questions become the same. What is important to drive that workflow? Okay. Here's another thing that we did that I find many IGs kind of miss, and even domain analysis models as well miss this. They love to jump into UML. I love UML. It's great. You can see a lot of the relationships. You can see the cardinality all in one. You can see all the attributes and the classes. However, that means nothing to the clinician. So what did we do? We actually took it a step back and decided, let's just do straight mind mapping. So we used Coggle. You could use XMind, FreeMind. And as soon as we did that, suddenly it became a lot more relatable. We had these clinical oncologists saying, oh, I get this. I understand why this is going on. And I can't stress enough that the conceptual model really should be preceding the notion of the logical model, right? Create it after, at least after you have these bubbles and buckets of different clinical information ideas. And then if you have at least those clinical SMEs going, okay, I can see how that works, then go ahead and delve in deeper a little bit more. It doesn't take that much to do conceptual models, okay? And finally, create the data dictionary with the logical model elements to a clinical information crosswalk. It's the thing I call the Rosetta Stone. That, in some respects, becomes your contract with a clinical community. Okay, so here's the example for those who have not seen the mCODE FHIR implementation guide. This is actually on our front page, on the index page of the IG. We had been working on a tooling that would allow us to do this a bit more dynamically, but it's actually very difficult to do, especially when you have color codes. But this is what we had currently. We avoided UML, and you can see that we color-coded it. If we took it from the example of the use case in free text, it was like, well, looks like you have things like medications and surgical and radiation procedures, comorbid conditions, and so forth. And this, when we showed it, again, there have been multiple models that were shown from different communities for cancer, and this was the one that they most related to very quickly. Okay. So we gathered the relevant clinical information, and we figured out, well, We've got now some nice bubbles. Now at that point, it kind of makes sense to split them, that categorization, into the different domains. And that's also, as an example, you're going to see it inside our the Excel spreadsheet that I uploaded into Dropbox. As you start categorizing these things into domains, now you're going to realize that, well, these clinicians, while they're authoritative in the workflow that they're working on, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have the comprehensiveness and the completeness of all the data that you need. So now this is the part where you start filling in, well, there could be certain data elements that we probably need to complement on top of what they have created. Because otherwise you're going to have an incomplete model, I almost guarantee it. Right? So if we were to thread the needle from what we had before, let's say that we have medications, and certain conditions, now you start thinking, well, inside that use case, they have this idea within their workflow, but there's the implied set of information that they just didn't go ahead and have identified. This is the part, again, in a Rosetta Stone fashion. The ones that they could have already identified, like a problem name, becomes very clear. And the ones that you figure probably need to be complemented as extra metadata behind it are the ones that you want to be highlighting and say new. And that's the part where you start going through that agile process of going back to that same community and go, hey, okay, that information, not using the word data, that information, even though you're seeing the word data element name, maybe there are things like the medication start date and the stop date that we might be missing. Is this something that we need to have at that point in time? They might say no, and we still might need it because you're going to extract it from an EHR, but at least what they know is that you're grabbing it, that it's not magically showing up at the end of it. You're now bringing them into that kind of crosswalk and giving them a Rosetta Stone to help them trace it through. Okay, so in this example, if you looked at the story, you'll find that, oh yeah, they had that particular condition for type 2 diabetes. They didn't say in there where the start and stop date are. Now you're identifying it and you're saying this could be a comorbid condition in the context of cancer. Now they go, oh, okay, that's really cool. I get it. Okay. This is a very busy slide. Oh, go ahead.
Just one question. So
yeah.
I missed then the part of the logical model here because so I see that you have the Rosetta Stone and I see that you have the mind map part, but I'm missing like
the visual logical
the
model.
Rosetta Stone outcome of it.
Yep. So I'd love to take this offline, but UML can be introduced at that point. We did not use UML. Instead, what we did create, and thank you for pointing that out, what we did create is within our tooling, we did have a logical model that was generated using something called Simple, or the clinical information model profiling language. And within there, it gets generated so that you can see where some of those relationships are, but it's not in a visual form.
Okay.
But there is a notion of a logical model. We didn't jump straight into FHIR for that, okay? But that is a good point. So in the translation of the information of data elements, this is a very busy slide, but it's meant to highlight something else that becomes very important as you're doing clinical requirements, and it's this notion of temporality. It could very well be, as you're creating your model, that not every set of clinical information is relevant at a particular point in time. And that starts generating the conversation in your requirements of, okay, you gave me a whole workflow analysis, and you said, during the time that a patient first comes in, this is the kind of information that I would like. Clinically, I would have a workup, and then a diagnosis, potentially some treatment options, and then this notion of monitoring survivorship that ends up going, in this case, in multiple cycles. If I were to say, well, staging is extremely important for me and we want this, Then the next question is, how useful is your model depending upon the provider having a patient when they first come in? It could very well be that your model, for maybe depending on the site, if they wanted to have this, if they say, oh, outcomes are important for me, but you have about 80% of your healthcare providers that are in this phase, in this usage, then outcomes are not that important for you, obviously, or you're not going to have it at that point in time. There has to be a certain clinical assumption at that point that the patient's at least gone through one line of therapy, at least as it relates to cancer. So it's something that as you go through a lot of the tooling that happens right now, always keep this in mind because it helps you to prioritize the elements that become important in your model. If there are so many elements that you have to start thinking about the prioritization and start thinking about, at that point, which elements give you most bang for your buck in the workflow. Okay. Again, in developing the FHIR IG, I think it was also mentioned before, this notion of profiling. I don't know how many people have actually created profiles, but it's so easy to do proliferation. It is kind of a buzzword we kind of use a lot more because if you think about it, you go to simplifier.net, you can already start seeing thousands and thousands of profiles, right? It's very easy to fall into that trap. But regardless, there's a lot of FHIR profiling and IG creation tools that are available that you can have for developing this IG. I've listed a number of them. I've tried a number of them. And I'm not going to give a preference to anyone in particular, including the one that's currently going to be in development. So called FHIR shorthand. And if you're interested in that, please attend that. I think it's a bird of a feather somewhere, or a design session from Mark Kramer. So please check that out. That's the only plug. But aside from that, I think they all have pros and cons. For the one that we use, as mentioned, we use Simple. It allowed us to do one thing that was really good from the FHIR IG point of view, is it allowed us a lot of flexibility in documentation. What would we recommend? Again, keeping the clinician involved in this, and I don't see that many IGs that are taking this approach, is that this introductory material needs to be understood by multiple stakeholders. We did this on purpose. Our very first page is meant to be so generic that you can have a clinician read the first half of it and go, okay, I get the main concepts that are behind this. And we did have a section and a dedicated page for implementation guidance that was very detailed on, all right, well, we recognize our emphasis on US core, and we're considering internationalization at this time. That's not the content that really has an impact on its use to clinicians or even project leaders for that respect. So we separated it out. We separated the non-technical and the technical piece. And what we also did was we included the original use case scenarios. So that way, there's an idea of the context that helped to drive the elements that we chose for it, noting that there were so many elements that they wanted to add. And that actually happened with mCODE. Some people are going to scratch their heads and go, why didn't you include radiology reports? I mean, isn't that crazy? You need it for cancer clinical staging. Why didn't you include that? In all honesty, it was actually in the use case scenario. But when we started speaking with the clinical community, they kind of took a step back and said, yeah, that's kind of important for us, but if our use case is actually to start thinking about treatment options, we've already staged. So if I actually took it a step back and thought about it in terms of where they wanted the actual or the emphasis upon what was driving the guide, it turns out actually that it's in diagnosis and treatment. So that already started taking away a lot of the potentially earlier things that wasn't necessarily exactly driving the treatment. So okay. And again, include the data dictionary and the clinical information crosswalk. This is, again, now it feels like I'm really plugging in our tool, but in using the simple tool, it provided, we added in this extra feature that allowed us to start building the majority or semi-automated generating a majority of our elements with the definitions inside an Excel spreadsheet. It's part of the export. So it really helped to reduce the amount of overhead in updating and maintaining spreadsheets. And as much as I hate spreadsheets in general, it seems to be the prevailing format for many clinical subject matter experts. Okay. Now we start getting a little bit more technical, and I gotta admit, in things like search parameters and operations, yes, the clinician starts taking a step back, but that becomes extremely important, as I learned in a number of Da Vinci implementation guides that I've been either reviewing or contributing to. It becomes very important because it may actually help further constrain the implementation of and the model itself. And that ends up being very surprising. That's part of the pragmatic portion of saying, well, okay, I've got all these elements. Well, how do you expect to have it returned? Oh, as a big bundle. Really? Really, you want the entire patient history in a FHIR bundle? I mean, then that starts putting in the world of CCDA. You could just have basically entire history just sent to you. No, in some cases, it might help to identify what is that minimum set. And especially in something like mCODE, minimal was really the prevailing requirement for us, right? And applying to all cancers. So, creating FHIR examples for each profile. I cannot stress the importance of examples. I don't know how many people have written examples. I would love to see a show of hands of people who have actually written FHIR examples. Exactly. We all love to model, but we don't like writing examples, right? Because they're painful. But I cannot help. I am such a converter of, a believer of examples, because it really helps at that point, especially in the narrative piece, to go, okay, clinician, this is really what you would like at this point in time. They'll say yes. And then when you step through, here's how I can represent it, you'll be surprised how short your model comes. Right? Yes, question.
You showed before this spreadsheet with which you could create the implementation guide directly with. Do you have something similar, for example?
Oh my God, I've been asked that so many times. I wish I could do that. Actually, I don't at this time, but it's something that's been in the back of my head to do for later this month. I know I've been playing with some Python scripts to just quickly, go through some table formats and just create them. But right now, I think that work is currently being explored. Another plug in FHIR shorthand, where if you have you can have this keyword called FHIR instance, and they actually have a bulleted format, and from it you can go ahead and specify certain parameters. It's not spreadsheet, but it's an easy to write syntax that can eventually create FHIR examples. And then of course there's also some of the ClinFHIR work, right? That you saw if you stayed for the demo, you could have seen. It's a description language, actually. Yeah. There is a session on FHIR shorthand, and a FHIR shorthand is based on simple. But the idea behind FHIR shorthand, now it feels like I'm talking about FHIR shorthand. the idea is that eventually. It's not about promoting a simple tool, it's about having multiple tools come together and agree on a more easier, understandable form of syntax that one can potentially create examples for or even do profiling with. So it's one of the benefits to help standardize tools. Right? must include a narrative which reflects the structured representation, but really, here's where the devil's in the details. If you have it too much like structured representation, then it also becomes not really understandable by clinicians. And I'll get to that in the next slide, I think, or the next 2 slides. And create a capability statement if it's applicable. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so here's the example, right? For those who have created FHIR examples, if you know the IG publisher actually, if you don't include a narrative, it'll create one for you. Okay, and you'll see that it looks like this. It'll say generated narrative with details. And you'll see it says ID and meta and clinical status with the value set and the code and so forth. And this starts looking really jumbled. And I've actually had a number of clinicians when we've showed this version going, I don't know what to do with this. So why not then create a user-friendly template? Right? So in this case, what could this mean? 5 minutes. Okay, this could mean that you remove this notion of the SNOMED CT codes, you leave the display text, and then potentially, not just the display, if there is the clinician-friendly text inside that codable concept all the way at the bottom, then include that instead. Now it becomes a lot more tangible. Okay. Again, create examples that can validate against these FHIR profiles, but also in a format that the clinician can relate to. And then set up a reference implementation server, which I ended up doing. And if anyone's ever not tried it, it's really easy to set up an HSPC sandbox. It took me 5 minutes, honestly. And it took me another 15 to upload, the mCODE structure definitions. But why not have this? Why? Because it's easier to get to the next phase to kick the tires with it. It allows you to go ahead and have, postman calls. And it's nice because you can see, here's the example. This is my mCODE example that I used for the Connectathon this past September. You can see this is the patient that I created, and now you can potentially, sit back with a clinician who's like, all right, well, here's the example that I'm showing you, and here's the things that it's using. Okay, and then finally, I got maybe a minute. The release for quote trial use, again, pressure test it. I think there's a huge value in setting up a reference implementation. Huge. Oops. And then, the rest is pretty obvious. Obviously, you want to have some pilot sites if they're available. Okay. So a little bit of the summary. For defining the use case, I think I've gone through a quick example of each one of them, except for the logical model. I didn't want to forget you for that. But I can definitely take that offline to show you how we did the logical model again. And the Java doc format that it presents in using our tooling. We translated the information elements. Again, this becomes key. This Rosetta Stone crosswalk is your contract in some respects. It's your bond to the clinicians because you can almost see it going in both directions at that point, right? And then finally, in developing the IG with pulling in the data dictionary and creating a reference implementation and testing it in Connectathons. So that's pretty much, I think, for the most part, what we ended up doing with mCODE. And while we know that's not necessarily a perfect IG, we thought it gave a great foundation. We had great feedback inside our ballot comments saying how wonderfully clear it was, for different people within the community. And we're, in that aspect, we're really proud of that. And we can hope that others, as they build IGs, can follow a similar pattern. Again, I think it's kind of been a discussion whether it was in the past working group meeting or even you might hear it here. But as you standardize, as we're moving forward in FHIR to standardize implementation guides, the documentation behind it and making it more accessible to people who are not just engineers, but who are also project leaders and clinicians is becoming more and more relevant. So hopefully you can take some of these takeaways with you, and I think that's it for me. I'm going to stay around to answer some questions, or I can take one before the end. Okay. Good. Thank you very much.